All right, I've been given the cue, and welcome to this panel on the future threat landscape in cyberspace. My name is George Little of the Brunswick Group, and I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed panel. As you all know, 2014 was deemed to be the year of the hack. The president recently went to Silicon Valley and called this arena the Wild Wild West. Secretary Ash Carter at DoD recently went to Silicon Valley, and Jay Johnson, the Secretary of Homeland Security, went there as well. And both departments announced that they're opening cyber offices to try to do greater outreach to Silicon Valley and the tech community. This is clearly an issue on the minds of government officials, but it's also an issue on the minds of corporate leaders as they grapple with the emerging threat landscape that we face. With me to discuss these very serious issues is first Mr. Rami Efrati, the founder and CEO of Furmitas Cyber Solutions. He is the former head of the Civilian Sector Division at the National Cyber Bureau in the Prime Minister's office in Israel. We have Shawn Henry, the president of CrowdStrike Services. Shawn is also the former executive assistant director of the Criminal Cyber Response and Services branch at the FBI. We have Tom Kellermann to his left, the chief cybersecurity officer at Trend Micro, and then Siobhan McDermott, last but not least, a principal in the cybersecurity group at Ernst & Young. The first question that I'm going to throw open to my colleagues has to do with their view of the current trends with cyber attacks. What shifts are you seeing recently, and how would you rate the sophistication of those trends or the threats that we face, the actors that are perpetrating cyber attacks these days and their intent? Where are we headed, broadly speaking? And I'll throw it open to anyone, but maybe we'll start with you, Rami, since you're immediately to my left and drew the short straw.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Dr. Latriante, for inviting me here. It's great to have you here also, all of you. I'd like to speak about some new ideas which became true. And the first one of them is that we are moving from hackers to organized groups. Suddenly we can find out, let's talk about terrorism, organizations like Hamas and like others who you would never believe that they can do very sophisticated things, but today they can get it in the market. They can get it in the darknet, in the deep web, and they can use it. And this is suddenly something that we found out, and this is going to be to make a big change all over. We come to it because we started to see activism done by terrorist groups, and we are going to see more and more. What brought it? The idea that brought it to become a real one was, as a matter of fact, the anonymity of cyber. And this is because today, if somebody is going to attack Israel from Lebanon, for instance, it will be very easy for us to identify where was the missile launched from. When it comes from cyber, it's very difficult to come and say, unless the guy is admitting that he did it, yes, we did it and it came from Gaza. And usually terrorism or terror organization would not like to do it. This is one of the changes. The second one is that suddenly we found out that nation states sponsor cyber attacks. We see that there is a moving from weapon to persistent threat and espionage. This is also a second change that I realized when I was dealing with this thing and doing today. And something new came out to the market. As we speak about security as a service, I think that now we started to speak about cyber espionage as a service. If we take, for instance, the North Korean case, there are some rumors that the North Korean brought the services of a Chinese hacker groups, meaning that now you can come and hire this organization in order to make the work for you, and this makes your life much easier. And we also find out that new groups, very high sophisticated professional people, starting to team together, mainly in the cybercrime, and can act against nations. These are the main things. The last one is that there is a convergence from a physical world and cyber. We start to understand that SCADA is not just a protocol. This is a way that you can blow up electric companies and other energy, finance, transportation, and others as well. And when I'll talk later, I'll speak about what are the new trends in these things that are happening these days?
Rami, thank you. Shawn?
So you say 2014 was the year of the hack. I think 2014 is the year that the media started to focus on the hack, because this has been going on for over 15 years, and actually beyond that in a number of different areas. What we're seeing now today has been across every sector, every vertical for over a decade. And because the media is focused on it, I think it's gotten the attention of a lot of folks, including CEOs and boards of directors. The commercial sector has started to pay attention. They recognize the risk, and for me, that's a very positive thing. In terms of the emerging threats, I think what we saw at Sony has changed this game quite a bit. Although we've seen destructive attacks previously, Sony has raised it here in the United States, and because it was so expansive, because it was so damaging, and because it happened within the confines of the United States by a nation state, I think that has absolutely changed the way we look at this. Most people still think that in the general public, certainly not here in this room, but most people in the general public still think the Sony was about emails being read about Angelina Jolie being a spoiled brat, which may or may not be true. However, the fact that the network was burned down is something that should take everybody's concern. It's not about the theft of data, the confidentiality of data, but the fact that we can move towards destructive attacks. As Rami stated, I think the terrorist issue, the increasing sophistication of terrorist groups, including AQ and ISIS, their interest in targeting critical infrastructure and recognizing that by sending malicious electrons, ones and zeros through the pipes, they can actually cause as much damage as they could from a kinetic attack here in the United States and other Western countries. So to see that increased interest, to see the increase in capabilities, and to see the increased movement by nation states to get into SCADA systems, by terrorist groups to target critical infrastructure, I think that is a whole new dynamic for us in this space, and it's something we've got to pay attention to.
Do you see Sony as unique or a sign of things to come?
I see Sony as a watershed moment. I see a nation state that used this attack vector as an opportunity to make a very strong statement, both a political statement and, quite frankly, what I see as a terrorist act, trying to influence people's behavior, which is the very definition of terrorism. And I see that that is a sign of things to come when those from outside the space see not only the impact of what happened in Sony and the amount of publicity that occurred there in what was a sophisticated attack, but the response of the U.S., what that was or what it wasn't. And I think that it all starts to fall into their playbook in terms of how they may use that technology for similar type of activity.
Great. Tom?
To that point, if Sony was the canary in the coal mine, there's a lot of dead birds down there. We conducted a statistically significant study in conjunction with the OAS recently of critical infrastructure operators from Canada to Argentina. We asked them the same question. The primary question being, have you experienced Sony-like attacks, delete and destroy attacks on your infrastructures? 44% said yes. And that's because, realistically, all the hackers of the world know that the code Destover that was used in that attack is widely available in the dark forums, and you just need to apply it once you attack a system. Make sure you apply it to the backup systems first to make sure that you've destroyed everything. What's even more problematic nowadays is the home invasion concept, in that many hackers nowadays will recognize and appreciate that if you're capable, once you terminate command and control on them, why not destroy the evidence through a destructive attack? So it's kind of counter-incident response phenomenon to inhibit you from reacting to them. This is becoming more mainstream. The evolution of attack capabilities is primarily due to the Eastern European arms bazaar and now the burgeoning Brazilian arms bazaar of automated attack code capabilities. There's been an explosion of the use of exploit kits from Sweet Orange to Angler, fileless malware, and attacks against cloud apps. And we need to appreciate significantly from a tactical perspective that they are using steganography to obfuscate themselves from our response. And they're using all sorts of interesting lateral movement capabilities. And yes, they are hunting iOS. The recent Pawn Storm campaign that's been very effective in penetrating US government agencies was purposely built to bypass technologies like FireEye sandboxing technology by using time-oriented payloads by using dynamic command and control, and then leveraging attacks against end users to iOS through X-agent capabilities that actually leveraged proximity settings. The problem here is that the nation states of the world, the ones who should have control in this domain, they no longer have a monopoly on developing this APT-like phenomenon, and we're seeing the true commoditization of this type of capability in the wild.
Thanks for that rosy outlook, Tom. All right, Siobhan.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I would say, from our perspective, we look at this a little bit differently because we're not sitting in the technology stack per se and looking at the threats necessarily directly. We look at it from the notion of the fact that, the bad guys were originally looking at IP theft. Now we're starting to see that as an emerging trend moving towards market manipulation, where you're starting to actually change market dynamics in a country. They're getting more sophisticated, and it changes the discussion around risk, and it also elevates security from being a security discussion up to a boardroom discussion or even a C-suite discussion more broadly. The risks are, still there from a business perspective, but many times the compromise is the vehicle is a cyber attack, meaning that that's how the risk in the organization is compromised. So we look to understanding not only the threat intelligence component, but also understanding economic anomalies across businesses, and then we overlay that with geopolitical risk assessment to understand sort of how those three things fit together that create a trifecta, which looks at risk in a different way.
Great, thank you. Why don't we pick up on the board point there, Siobhan? A lot has been said. I'm sure you heard it last week as well, for those of you who are at RSA. This is an issue that's moved from the IT department to the general counsel, to the C-suite, and to boards. And I think that in many corporations, boards do get it, and they worry about it, but do they get it? And so I guess that's my question to the panel. Do boards get it today? Do they have the sophistication and the know-how to grapple with the emerging threats that we face in cybersecurity?
So I think it depends largely on the industry and the sophistication of the board. It also depends on whether they've been under a significant attack or not. We see this increasingly becoming a concern at the C-suite, let alone the board, where people are starting to have those discussions because as these stories come out in the media, somebody from the board says to the CEO, hey, what are you guys doing about that? Tell us, now report to us, and they're sort of put in this defensive reporting back position. Boards are increasingly asking the questions. We hear it a lot from audit committees. They really want to understand where the risk sits in the business, whether they're going to have to attest to some kind of cybersecurity attestation at some point in the future with liability and responsibility. How should they be thinking about it? Should they be, worried? Should they have a direct line down to the CISO? All these are the types of questions that we get asked all the time, and I think the sophistication of boards is improving and getting, they're getting much more educated about the topic. They're starting to want to understand more about it, but it's still a little bit of a business risk discussion versus a technical discussion, and sort of bridging that gap is something that I think helps address that.
Welcome thoughts from others, but is the audit committee the right place to park this issue? Or should there be some kind of alternate governance mechanism inside a corporation?
Well, I would say that I think the board in general should have, the right provisions in place to make sure that they're paying attention to cybersecurity. Whether that sits in the audit committee or some other committee, from my perspective is largely not that relevant. But if you think about it, somebody has to sign up and say, I'm going to take the risk and I'm going to make sure that we're looking at this in the right way. And in some countries and some companies, we're starting to see an actual IT committee being founded or cybersecurity committees being founded on the board that comprise a bunch of different folks. The audit committee generally is part of that just because of the economic impact of the business.
Thanks. Shawn?
I think that this has to be a business risk. Technology is a piece of the solution, and it's a way to leverage capabilities, and it's a way to get visibility into what's happening. But I think it's more about policy and process and people, and that boards need to see this as a business risk, much like they see every other risk to their organization, whether it be currency fluctuation or building out new plants and factories in foreign nations, and what those risks are, what the challenges to your products by competitors. Those are all risks, and this is a risk just like that. There are a lot more similarities to that than there are differences, and I think that when they start to look at it in a fundamentally different way, they lose sight. And I've seen too many people push away from the boardroom conference table and say, hey, I'm not a technology guy. I don't get it. I don't understand technology. This is not me. And I tell them all the time, this is about you. This is about a risk to the organization. Let's focus on what the impact is to your company, what the continuity issues are with your company, what this is going to cause and cost your employees, your shareholders, you personally, what's it going to cost the economy, the national security. So focus on those things. And I think when they start to see it that way and recognize that you don't have to be a technology expert to understand the business risk issues, that you're in a much stronger position to add value. A lot of the board members that I speak to are in a different generation. They haven't grown up with the technology, they haven't grown up with the network, they don't, and that's why they feel distance from it, but they bring so much value and so much experience because of so many other things that they've done in their lives. If they bring those experiences to the boardroom, to this issue, they can add tremendous value.
If I may also, this is a brand protection issue. If you look at the secondary infections that attack various corporations, and that, number one, we're doing a terrible job of incident response that isn't mapping to the lateral movement of the adversary. But that being said, there's a 25% increase of watering holes. These are legitimate pages on legitimately good, righteous websites that are now attacking people who visit them. And if you think about the concept of, are they primarily worried about losing intellectual property or sensitive customer data, and that's what they have to react to? Or are they worried about their brand actually attacking people who trust their brand, who trust their mobile apps, who trust their websites for information? The greatest irony in the last 6 months has been more and more 0 days for WordPress are coming out. Who's responsible for updating WordPress on a corporate website? It's the chief marketing officer's team. So there actually should be an allocation of budget from the chief marketing officer for the purposes of brand protection. I think this conversation of brand protection beyond your holy grail being stolen is far more important of a conversation to have at the board today.
Rami?
I'd like to speak a little bit about the case of Israel. I think from two things we learned a lot. Of course, we learn it every day because Israel is one of the most attacked countries in the world. We're not the only one, but we are one of the countries to be attacked. And learning from the, let's call it the first national political cyber extortion, the Sony case, and the yearly attack on Israel, which is usually on April 7, when Anonymous is usually attacking Israel, we understood that we have to do several things. The first one of them was to identify what are the professions of cyber. And we came out with about 40 professions. But of course, with 40 professions, we cannot work. So we decided, when I say we, I still use it we, but this is the Israeli National Cyber Bureau, decided to identify a group of 4 professions. And now the next case is, okay, how we are going to train them, how we are going to educate them, how we are going to certify them in order to make sure that they are able to work on each one of its level. Let's imagine that we are speaking about critical infrastructure, energy. It's level 5. Only people certified for level 5 will be able to work on this case. This was the first thing that we have done. The second one was that the government of the State of Israel just got a decision to establish something new in the world. It's called the National Cyber Authority, which is a regulated organization to make sure that the civilian market is going to be prepared at the right way for cyber attack. The question of Sony raised, of course, the question about what is the role of the country? What is the role of the government? So I'm not going to speak now about intelligence and payment, but let's start with the government ministries. It has just passed a regulation in Israel that every ministry in Israel should take from its IT budget 7% just for cybersecurity. It is a signal to all the others. And since most of the companies are regulated in a way by the relevant ministries, let's take the Ministry for Energy for a second. Ministry of Energy, when you would like to renew your annual business license, you have to go through a checklist of several things that you had to do with cyber. Otherwise, your license is not going to be renewed. And we are doing these things. And this brought us also, and this is the last word, to a new market that I don't know if we'll have the time to speak about it. And it comes to what Henry spoke, and this is insurance. Because the minute you would like to be insured, that minute you will have to be well prepared in a, let's call it in a strategy that your company has to come out with and follow it.
That's a good question. Let me follow up on that, Rami. A lot of companies are investing in cyber technologies and so forth to defend, and that's appropriate, obviously. Are they investing in enough to prepare for the eventuality of a cyber attack? The new normal, of course, is that everyone's getting attacked all the time, right? It's not a question of if, but when. And is there enough investment in preparedness?
You know what the irony of that question is? The World Bank and IMF put out the only significant stat on the migration to the internet for businesses, which was 98 cents on the dollar saved by migrating away from brick and mortar to e-commerce, e-finance at all. Yet less than 3 cents of those savings on average is being spent to sustain or secure that. So I would say no. And we can't keep playing the little game of three little pigs here, given that you have nation-state adversaries, terrorist adversaries, and criminal hackers that have now expanded beyond the traditional digerati of the hacker community, but you now have narco-traffickers, non-state actors, and activist groups that have significant attack capabilities that were purposely built, that they bought online, that can bypass perimeter defenses as we know it.
Which means, building on what Tom just said, and he's exactly right, it needs to move to detection and response, right? We certainly have to have defense in depth, and we have to worry about prevention and try to prevent what we can prevent, but the reality of it is we're not going to prevent it. The most sophisticated adversaries are going to get on your network. It might take them a few weeks, it might take them a few months, it might take them years in extreme cases, but they're getting on. If you can detect them, you can mitigate them. If you allow them onto the network for 4 months or 8 months or 2 years, they're going to have destructive capability. When I say destructive, I mean the impact, whether it be the theft of data or the actual destruction of data. In all of the significant breaches that we've seen over the last 2 years, the adversaries have been in those networks for months, completely undetected, which means that they had unfettered access to everything that was occurring on that network. It's not unlike the physical world. If we can detect adversaries, whether they be terrorists or criminals, if we can detect them, we can mitigate them. But if we allow them to run their schemes, to run their espionage operations, to set up their campaigns, to blow things up, bad things are going to happen. They've got to be detected and disrupted. We take that same philosophy and move it to the network.
I believe that one of the things that has to be changed is technology. We are all fighting the old war, and we have to make a big change in our way of thinking and in our technology. I believe, and I'm not going to speak about my company, but you can understand, I believe that we have to come with a new technology that will be without any signature-based, that can identify APTs in the same minute that it comes, no installation, and other things. I believe it can be done. And one of the things that Israel decided to do is to become a leading country in cyber technology. We are very small, but just to let you know, we have today more than 300 companies dealing with cyber technology, meaning we also took the threat into an opportunity, a financing opportunity, but this is something that we share with all over the world.
If I also may make one point, there's an architectural problem here. Just like we say we have to move away from compliance exercises more to proactive defense in depth, obviously. And obviously this is a game of time, and we're fighting against the clock. Architecturally, we need to move away from creating a fortification that's impenetrable to attack. We need to move more towards the architecture of that of a prison. How can we decrease their capacity to move laterally in our systems? How can we decrease the amount of time they can maintain persistence on a system while obfuscating themselves? How do we make them more resource constrained to get out of our systems with the data they want? There may or may not be an answer to that, but I think that's the answer in terms of an architectural model.
Great, thank you. Let's move now to what's growing, in my opinion anyway, and that's the divide between Silicon Valley and Washington, this town. There are a lot of flyover states in between us and California, and that manifests itself in mistrust, distrust, misunderstanding from time to time. Well, do you agree with that assessment, number one? And what do we do to close the gap? On the left coast, many in Silicon Valley want the government just to stay out of the business, right? And here, we want to partner with companies for any number of reasons. What do we do to resolve these issues? Shawn, do you want to kick us off?
Thanks for the easy question. One of the things that I would say is that in this world, geopolitics plays an increasing role, and that geopolitical statement is not exclusive of the states within the United States. Having spent the last 15 years or so in Silicon Valley and really listening to the whole, we don't want to share with the government because we never get anything in return, we're going to do it our way, we know everything, we're the smartest guys in the room, and spending a lot of time on the policy side in DC saying, we don't get why they don't want to play with us. It is a very interesting dichotomy, and I think until you start building up the trust and understanding of what everybody gets out of the equation and how that's going to work and whether it really is going to make the world a safer place. That seems to be the discussion. And then you have to layer on the complexity of the whole privacy issue around that, and the notion of, not giving up too much information for the sake of national security, not being seen as being too closely aligned with the U.S. government in some instances because of the whole Snowden effect and the potential brand damage that those companies have suffered outside of the United States in order to be able to continue doing business. So it's going to take time, but I think, there have been some announcements this week and recently where you're starting to see a lot more action and a lot more attention on this topic and starting to get more people involved in the debate. So it's good.
I'll go.
Okay, go for it.
You asked a question earlier about the government's role in this space. Maybe Rami said it. I think the government's fundamental responsibility, any government's fundamental responsibility, regardless of the country, is to protect its citizens. That's its primary responsibility, to protect its citizens. And again, I see this risk as a significant economic and national security threat, and I think the government has that responsibility. In the physical world, we all know how governments respond to physical threats from adversaries. We see it all the time, whether it be scrambling of jets or the amassing of armies, shooting down missiles, whatever it may be, to protect the citizens, anything at any cost to protect the citizens. In this space, that's not happening. You've got malicious code that is landing on every single corporate network, and it's not being stopped by the government. They're not filtering it, they're not blocking it, they're not shooting it down. That's not happening, and it's not because they wouldn't do it if they could do it. They don't have the capability, the authorities, the capacity to do it in today's environment for a lot of reasons, which are probably beyond the discussion here. I think that when Silicon Valley looks to the government, I've been talking to people in the private sector for the last 3 years pretty extensively, and they are upset that they are being forced literally to fight against nation states. You've got 25-year-old men and women in this country that are fighting trained Army nationals from foreign governments. And that's a task that can be somewhat overwhelming. And what the folks in the private sector are asking for is, what is the government's role? The government says we need to share information. I say we don't need to share information. I say we need to share tactical intelligence. We have to share information, intelligence that is of value, something that people can put into place to help protect their networks. The private sector, on the other hand, needs to know who's getting the information, what are they doing with it, is it protected when I share it, and what am I getting back? Because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to collect that intelligence and to share it, and there's some risk associated with it. And I think that many companies would be happy to do that if they saw a value, if they saw a return. And until we define the parameters and set up that framework, we're going to hear people keep talking about information sharing, public-private partnership. It's great, it sounds good. It makes sense, and intuitively it makes sense. But until we actually see the framework clearly defined, until the companies understand the value, we are not going to see that in any measured way.
And in the absence, to quote Melissa Hathaway, in the absence of an industrial policy, we're fighting this war with two hands tied behind our back. To echo my colleagues' points, there is another Silicon Valley. There's a Silicon Valley in the east. That's between basically Reston and Annapolis. That's developing the next generation of cybersecurity capabilities, which from my perspective is the only way the internet is going to be sustainable in the next 20 years. We're being colonized, but the irony of the conversation, discussion between Silicon Valley and DC is that Silicon Valley does not actually take cybersecurity seriously. And the last time they did was Operation Aurora, that I'm sure you investigated and you worked on, when they cried for help.
I know nothing.
And they had to cry for help. But that being said, since then, how seriously did it take cybersecurity besides merely just investing in cybersecurity startups?
Let me tell you what we have done in Israel, because we don't have in Silicon Valley, although in the Silicon Valley there are so many people who are speaking Hebrew, because most of the well-known Israeli companies moved to the Silicon Valley.
And the flyover states.
And in Israel, as a small country, we are used to work with the government, so you will be surprised. But most of the companies that a government is going to ask them, can we work together and share the information, they will tell you one thing: we are ready to do it, just make sure that we are not going to be somehow offended by this, or a privacy issue as well. During the last 13 years, an organization called NISA, National Information Security Authority, headed by the Israeli Shin Bet, was established by the Israeli government In 2001, the government identified critical infrastructure as one of the main targets to be attacked in the future. And they identified several numbers, about 30 companies, electricity, blood, train, airplanes, etc., to become critical infrastructure. And everybody suddenly found that when the government would like to defend these companies, as a regulator, by the way, and nobody likes regulators, it works. And for the last 13 years, it is working, and it is working well. That's what enabled us now to create the new cyber authority, which is the one to make sure that the government will not only share information with the civilian sector, but also sharing means two sides. Also get the information from them at the right way, including with the approval of the trust authority, the antitrust authority, and we believe that it is going to be a big success.
Rami, as someone who's steeped in these issues, not just from an Israeli perspective, but from a non-US perspective as well, when you look at how this country is dealing with all of these issues in the tech community and the government, I mean, what are some things that you think we ought to be doing a little bit differently? Because we're certainly not getting it right in all places.
First of all, the US people are very professional. Let me put it this way. When we started in the Israeli National Cyber Bureau, I decided not as a regular Israeli, not to invent the wheel. Meaning, let's see what others are doing. The first organization that I went to visit after the DHS, was NIST, National Institute for Science and Technology, that comes out with the new technology approach. And we decided in Israel, for instance, to adopt most of the regulations or the standards done by the US in order to take it. Second, if you look very deeply into the documents that are coming as a strategy, it takes much longer than in Israel. Okay, you need to get the approvals, etc. I read yesterday the new the DoD new
Cyber strategy?
Cyber strategy.
Mm-hmm.
There are many things that we should learn from this. One of the things that we have done, and this is, I think this is a difference between you and us, we have decided, most of you maybe read the book Israel as a Startup Nation. So we decided to take it from Startup Nation to Cyber Nation. How? By deciding to finance and to help financing new startups with new technologies, knowing that for sure this is statistics, about 90 or 95% of them will fall down. But if we are going to have the next checkpoint, CyberArk, etc., this is what we need to do. The second one was to make sure that we will become a leading research center. And we decided to approach the US companies, the first US companies to establish its cybersecurity research center in Israel was GE, General Electric. It was followed by Cisco, IBM, Lockheed Martin, RSA, so many. Meaning that we cannot do everything by ourselves. We have to share, and we have to collaborate, and we have to speak together and coordinate all the activities. And I can assure you one thing, I'm not speaking politically now. When it comes to cyber, the best ally of the Israeli cyber is the USA. And this is something that we have to appreciate.
Great, thank you. Let's keep a little bit of an international flavor to the panel and move to Europe. The United States, it appears, is focused, American companies are focused primarily on cybersecurity, and we obviously have privacy debates going on as well inside this country. In Europe, it seems to be the reverse. The focus is on privacy, and cybersecurity, at least in the minds of some, is a very distant second. And what this creates in this country, in the United States, is the perception that there's not as much of a sense of urgency over cybersecurity issues. And some of our American officials have even said that one of this country's greatest vulnerabilities is Europe, because Europe is not gripping this the way they believe it should. Do you agree with those people? And how would you assess the debates that are currently ongoing on both sides of the Atlantic?
So I'll jump in and say that Europe might say the same thing about the United States. But I think...
Anybody in the media who quotes that was George Little who said that.
I attributed it to others.
I think that the interesting thing about Europe, and when you look at the whole privacy debate, if you think back to 100 years ago, people in Europe died over their convictions and when their private information was disclosed. That's not something that we here in this country are necessarily that aware of. So I think that they, from a perception of understanding the privacy debate, they take that much more seriously. And the whole notion of who you are as a private person, what you're allowed to, or what's allowed to be disclosed about you is very different. And so that does drive that debate on cybersecurity and privacy and that tension that exists between the two of them. I would say arguably before the NSA revelations, there was progress being made, I think getting a lot closer than probably we are today when it started up a whole bunch of more mistrust and trying to figure out how to get out of having these conversations about cross-border collaboration, because as it turns out, you guys were spying on us, we didn't like that. So those are the questions I think that are still largely out there. Even within Europe, I mean, the EU27 is incredibly complex. You've got countries that are very, very, where privacy is top of mind and really been driven, Germany, France, and you've got countries where it's less of an issue or it's at least more in line with what the US is thinking. So, you can't really view, I would say, Europe as one single entity. You still have 27 separate member states that are operating separately, just like we do here with the states. I mean, even if you look at data breach notification requirements are different on a state-by-state basis. So it's very complicated. And when you start trying to put those two together, everybody thinks, well, we're close allies, that should be easy. But, we've heard all morning about frameworks and the implementation of these complex global frameworks and just how difficult and time-consuming they are.
Tom?
And then there's Eastern Europe, which is like Robin Hood mentality, which is where the best cyber munitions are being developed and distributed into the dark web. I like the European approach, the Western European approach, in that you cannot make a distinction really between privacy and cybersecurity, and that you cannot achieve privacy without cybersecurity. But that being said, limitations on sharing or the capacity to share is an important premise. I'm a mom's Swiss, so I'm biased in this. But that being said, I think if we're going to look at solving this problem, we have to find ways to incentivize our partners in the world to deal with the issue. And I think the easiest way to do that is to modernize anti-money laundering. All of the funds being laundered associated with cybercrime, 95% of them are moving through disintermediated anonymous payment channels and digital currencies that are not regulated, that are not being dealt with through any of the anti-money laundering efforts of FATF. And FATF itself needs to be modernized. I think that can be used as a lever, as a carrot to incentivize, to begin to take back what's been stolen.
Swiss miss. So I don't think I agree with that George, in terms of Europe being really a kind of a vulnerability for the U.S. In my experience, I've done a lot of work in Europe, both in the Bureau and post-Bureau at CrowdStrike. And my experience is that perhaps the awareness is a little behind the U.S. because the U.S. has been targeted at a much higher rate because of its technology. But in my experience, particularly in the last couple of years, there are a lot of European companies that are getting involved in this. Back in 2000, I was on a cyber subcommittee for the G8 representing the US government, and UK, France, Germany were heavily involved in the cybersecurity aspect back then. That was 15 years ago. So this is not new to them. I think that as the realization comes into play, as more companies are being targeted, they recognize the risk. Much the same challenges we faced here in the US with US corporations over the last 5 years, but they are picking that up. The other piece I'll mention, I think it's important, is that I found most recently that there are not very many companies that call themselves U.S. companies. They are global companies. And I've dealt with organizations that have representation, employees, manufacturing, et cetera, in 100 countries or more. And they're dealing with the various laws and issues, et cetera. But they recognize that their European operations are as vulnerable as their U.S. operations, and there's really no distinction there. So when you look at it that way, I see this as really an issue that is targeting global society. It's not just a U.S. issue. This is certainly a global issue, and others are recognizing that.
I didn't find any problem to work either with European countries or with APAC, both Japan, Korea, and all the others. Everything is a question of culture. And the way to work together is to share the information with them. Meaning, if I have a problem in Israel and we, for instance, identify a malware coming to one of our banks, the same malware will be in 2 milliseconds also in Korea or in Japan or in Singapore or somewhere else or in Germany. So the minute you start to share the information, there are many ways to do it, not only by governments. You can do it by the certs. by the computer emergency response teams, etc., which works very well for many years. This is something that will enable you to come out on the gap about culture. We found out that most of the European countries started to update about what's going on. I read the BSI Germany report about one of the steel companies that was attacked. I didn't see it before. They didn't come out with the name of the company, but as a matter of fact, I don't care about it. The important thing is to understand what really happened, what could have been done. And the minute we will all start to share the information, although we didn't want to speak about sharing of information in this panel so much, between countries, I think that you will find out that it is much easier to work than you expect.
Any other thoughts? Okay. All right. Well, I will seize the gavel here and turn to another question, and that is, let's say that you have, I don't know, 30 seconds or 60 seconds in an elevator with the CEO or chairman of a company. What mitigation measures would you advise that he or she take, given the current and future nature of or threats that we face? Anybody? Bueller?
Okay.
So first of all, figure out what attack paths are actually viable. Conduct an immediate penetration test of the infrastructure to understand what attack paths are viable and remediate. Deploying things like breach detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, file integrity monitoring, virtual shielding. Two-factor authentication across the board, I think, are priorities.
Add to Tom's encryption, certainly, of data at rest, data in transit. From a mitigation strategy, I think, again, it comes back to detection and not just purely focusing on prevention, understanding who the adversaries are. I don't think we give enough attention to that. I think people are looking at blocking malware, and malware are merely the tools that are being used by a human being. Somewhere, there's a human being trying to get into your network. And regardless of the type of malware they use, you've got to understand who that person is, who that group is, what are their intentions, what are their tactics, what is it they're looking to get, which allows you as a network defender to be much more proactive in the way you defend that network. You can hunt on the network to look for indicators that the adversaries are there, so you can identify them and mitigate them quickly. If you don't, if all you do is fold back the drawbridge and try to ensure that nobody climbs over the wall, you are fighting a losing battle.
If I will meet the CEO in an elevator, I would ask him, first of all, whether he identified how much money he's going to lose if his company is not going to work for 6 hours, 12 hours, and 24 hours. If he doesn't know the answer, it means that he is not prepared. Second, I would ask him whether he make any risk analysis. Because if he'll make the risk analysis and he will come out with the priorities, all the rest he will understand how much he has to invest.
Shawn?
So I would elevate the discussion to a discussion about business risk, with cyber being at the core of that. Everything that you do across your business touches cybersecurity, and making sure that you understand that and you're thinking about that as you deploy new technologies, as you buy new companies, as you merge with companies, as you enter new markets, making sure that you think about it from a risk perspective and not just from perspective of understanding what you have on your network.
Thank you. The Internet of Things, or some companies call it the Internet of Everything. That's where we're headed. That's where technology is going. Medical devices, thermostats, et cetera, et cetera. What should we be thinking about differently given this new arena that we're moving into? And what does it mean for cybersecurity, and can we catch up with it?
I don't want the audience not to sleep well tonight, so I'm not going to give some horrible scenarios. But this is a new game changer. When we in my age, not in most of the audience age, are going to get some implanted devices for diabetes, pacemakers, and suddenly we become a target, not only a regular target, a personal target, because whenever I have something like this in my body, I'm an IP, and when I'm an IP and Internet protocol, I'm a target. The same goes for the new autonomous cars. I don't know how much you are aware what's going on today with the cars, how easily it is to hack into your cars. So I'm not going to give the scenarios, but just imagine yourself that you're reading a book while your car is driving automatically, and next to you there are another 2,000 cars. What's going on? And this is something that we have to come out with, first of all, with the technology, but with special regulations by the government, I believe, in order to start dealing with these things now, not to hide it, to make sure that all these things are being protected. So I know the FDA is starting to do some things with the medical device. I know the car manufacturers are worried about what's going on and they are interesting. But this is something that is going to change our life, and we have to take it very seriously.
And to that point, I think the bash bug for the technical in the audience was significant in that it affected about 40% of that future environment. We also, at some point, are going to have to recognize this is a personalization of cyber attack, obviously, has been described. So at some point, we're all going to need an administrator of things that can manage our homes and our lives and our children's lives and our experiences. But there's a limitation.
I need one of those at home.
There's a tremendous limitation on what kind of security you can actually employ on these devices because of their lack of memory. And so this is the conundrum that we face.
Anybody else on? Okay. Let's talk about critical infrastructure and from your vantage point, what sectors are doing cybersecurity well, or even beyond critical infrastructure, I guess, narrowly defined. What sectors in business are doing it well? Which ones need to catch up and do a little more homework?
I think it really depends company to company, quite honestly, but if you're looking at industries, I still think the financial services sector is probably in front for a number of reasons. First of all, the actual risk that we've talked about here, the actual cost in terms of attacks, lost intellectual property, research and development, et cetera, it's very hard to quantify. In the financial services sector, they're losing money, and it's very easy to quantify. So when you sit down with the board, you need more investment, it's very easy to say, we lost $100 million last year, we're looking for a $50 million investment in our security to help mitigate that loss for the year going forward. It's just much easier to quantify. I think that they've also been doing this for a much longer time because they've been facing this issue at least at a pervasive pace for well over a decade as compared to many other, as we've already discussed, verticals that still are just learning about what their risks are. So the FS-ISAC, Financial Services ISAC, is in my opinion, far and away the best way to share intelligence, actionable intelligence. Again, it's still not automated. It's still not happening at the speed of the network. It's happening based on relationships. It's good for what we have. It still can be better. But in terms of verticals, that's probably the one that's the most sophisticated, in my opinion.
Anybody else want to tackle that? Broad agreement? Who's not doing it well?
Healthcare is a disaster. So they're migrating to cloud-based everything and mobile everything for the delivery of services that will save lives. I respect that. But they're dealing with a conundrum in that some of the very best hackers of the world that used to be targeting just the financial sector have recognized that healthcare data is more valuable than financial sector data. And so they're being penetrated and colonized and leveraged. And it's not just about the initial intrusion that steals the information, the patient data, for the purposes of identity theft. It's the secondary infections by leveraging spear phishing campaigns against users or extortion schemes or turning the websites or the watering holes, generating those for other forms of infections. You have to understand when a hacker hacks you, they don't just take what they need and go. They then sell the backdoor in the system to someone else, and then they use it themselves at some point, maybe 3 months down the road, because they have an interest or a need. And then lastly, they use your infrastructure to island hop to move between the different ecosystems. I do think there's one institution, one organization in the sector that is doing a good job, that does have forward leaning, and that's the Mayo Clinic, for obvious reasons, I think. And then Jim Nelms and his leadership there demonstrates a certain proactive stance.
I would like very much to look at the future, not only about the existing situation, because, and I totally agree that finance organization, which are the richest one, they can afford more. And since yearly, there is, by cybercrime, the figures of money being stolen is more than $400 billion. Just imagine the number. You don't need to come with a Tommy gun anymore. But I'm looking at some new things that I believe which are also going to affect us. Maybe they're not critical. One of them are the new drones. CNN is having drones. Every other guys are having. 2 days ago, one of the drones was landed in Japan when somebody was speaking with a kind of nuclear...
radioactive material?
Yes.
Yeah,
just imagine yourself now that Federal Express or others are going to use drones to bring you, that's beautiful, excellent, to bring you the luggage directly into your house, but somebody is hacking into it, and instead of landing it easily, it is going to do other things, or to come very quickly into, just to jump into the crowd, meaning that we have to look about what is going to be, because IoT is already here. Maybe it's not as we are expecting it now. It will grow and grow and grow, but there are so many things. And the second one, weapon systems. We are all speaking about the commercial business, but what about weapon systems? Who is making sure that the tank is not going to shoot directly there, but is suddenly going to shoot you back to another place, or the missile, or something else? Meaning, we have very quickly to identify what can be done either by terrorists, or by nations, or by others, and come out with, if not with a technological solution, but at least with regulations. And I don't like the word, but we have to do it in several things to make sure that it will not happen to us.
I'm a former CIA spokesman, so I have to ask this question, and that's about terrorism. How sophisticated do you think groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others are right now, and how serious of an attack could they actually perpetrate?
I believe that there are two things. First of all, I don't think that they have the capability of a nation. But unfortunately, they are able to go to the darknet, to the deep web, to get it as a service, and to buy the most sophisticated zero-day attacks and other kinds of attacks in order to use it. Nobody else could do it in the past, meaning that you can just go to the market and suddenly you have the best sophisticated solution. The second issue, and this is mainly about ISIS, is the media. We have an attack done by Anonymous. This is one, I will correlate it with ISIS, on 7th of April, April 7th. And what is happening, we were very well prepared in the Israeli government. The National Cyber Bureau was in charge to coordinate all these things. And as a matter of fact, nothing happened. The civilians do not know what really we have done in order to make it. But if even one of the websites was falling down because of a 2-minute technological problem, the media came out with the message, this and this group was attacked by cyber, which was not correct. Meaning, some of the things like what ISIS is doing, using the cyber, using the media, in order to come out with whatever they are doing, this is something that I believe that makes them grow. And we have to do things against it. Of course, I'm not against the media. The media has to do its work, and they are doing it, but I think they have to do it in a very responsible way. If nobody is going to talk about Anonymous attacking Israel, believe me, nothing would happen. As a matter of fact, nothing happened. But the minute you come out and you magnify what didn't happen, then they got the effect that they wanted.
Great. So we've talked about Silicon Valley and DC and Europe. We really haven't talked about Wall Street, except in the context perhaps of financial institutions and companies that do it fairly well, cybersecurity. Some studies out there, or some people believe that, look, most companies can withstand even a pretty serious cyber breach. It's not going to hit their bottom line very much. Stock price, even in some high-profile cyber breaches that have made their way to the media, stock price hasn't really taken a hit. So are we over-worrying this right now? Or is the reverse true, and that we just need to have a greater sense of urgency? What do you tell a board that says, stock price, I don't know, don't see much impact? Shawn?
Not about the stock price. It's about,
Yeah.
it's about the economy. It's about the much broader impact on society as a whole. If you're talking about threats to critical infrastructure, every single network it's a network. They're all connected. If you're victimized, we see regularly different companies victimized as a stepping stone into another organization. Companies need to participate in this as a society, as members of an ecosystem. And that ecosystem is as fragile as its weakest link. I don't think that organizations need to look at it solely as what's the impact on our stock price. I think they need to look at it much more broadly as the impact on society going forward and future generations. I've equated this similarly, certainly not exactly to the level, but similar to nuclear deterrence, where we had a Cold War and we had this sense of mutual destruction which would hold nations at bay. I think in this space, the network is all connected, and if we start to see faults and cascading networks, there's going to have a long impact down the line. I think that this is much broader than what's our stock price. I think people need to be thinking in a long-term way. I think they need to be thinking in a socially responsible way about how do attacks like this, if they were to escalate, impact our society long-term for generations.
Shawn, I want to add to that?
So I would add to that, I think the most important thing is it's about trust. It's about trust in the marketplace. It's about your brand. It's about people's desire to continue to doing business with your brand. If your brand is damaged, I mean, if you look at some of the recent attacks, there were collateral brand damages of multiple organizations throughout that entire chain where consumers actually thought that the wrong brand was compromised. So, brand damage, reputational damage, protection of that, and making sure that you're still a trusted entity to do business with is something that I think is becoming more top of mind with boards.
And from the trader's perspective, all of the traditional frauds that were precipitated on the markets of the world can now be manifested through cyber. So if you're a very effective trader and you're world-renowned and the moves you make in the international markets are significant, you should expect to have some sort of digital presence on your device because people might want to front-run you. So there's that aspect too. And there's also been evidence recently that some cyber attacks definitely leveraged kind of schemes behind them vis-a-vis like shorting stocks. So we know that we've hacked this organization, we've stolen their information, and the second they terminate the command and control for our footprint, well, maybe now it's a good time to short stocks. And I think one of the biggest problems we're facing from a financial sector security perspective is the financial recession unemployed a lot of people, and those people shared their acumen vis-a-vis how the sector works. What are the nuances of the sector with a very illicit community of actors that are now, in some cases, utilizing it. But again, to Shawn's point, the financial sector of the United States specifically, I would say, is the most proactive cybersecurity community in the United States. But that being said, the very best hackers of the world are hunting that sector.
Let's talk about some specific examples. We've touched on Sony a little bit here, but what about Anthem and Home Depot and Target? What are some of the lessons learned from a response standpoint and from going public that you would highlight?
So I think one of the things that, again, looking at it from the board perspective and from the management team perspective, a lot of companies have done drills and they've done red team, blue team drills up to the point of the cybersecurity organization, but the whole communications response and understanding how general counsel gets involved, when they get involved, who from PR responds, really getting around that sort of incident management at that level from a communications perspective above the security layer once you've identified, mitigated, and defended against the breach is something that we're certainly seeing a lot more attention on. Companies are starting to say, hey, help us understand how to do this. Let's put a framework in place. Let's figure out who gets woken up at what time in the morning, depending on how severe it is. 90% of the time, these guys find out about it through the media because it's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, as opposed to understanding their own risk within their business or seeing it inside first. So understanding that whole preventative thing, I think, is something that's becoming much more front of mind.
Others? Tom?
I think that incident response needs to be modernized to deal with the lateral movement of the adversaries, to deal with the secondary infections. Even if they've stolen the crown jewels of what you have, are they now going to launch a spear phishing campaign against your user base? Are they now going to turn specific web pages or mobile apps against your user base? Is there still some remote access terminal somewhere in your infrastructure that's on a sleep cycle that they'll re-enter and use? One of the biggest challenges, I think, and it goes back to my days of being a penetration tester, ethical hacker, is that pen testing should be applied to incident response as well. If I think this box is compromised, I can't trust my network diagram to tell me where they could have gone from here. And realistically, many times the logs have been so obfuscated through crypto that I'll never know. So you should viably figure out what are the viable attack paths from here and re-image all those boxes too.
So the employee is a vulnerability, and sometimes the employee is a perpetrator, right? This is an issue, the insider threat. How are companies and government institutions, for that matter, grappling with this? What are some of the best practices that you see in business or in government? And what are some things not to do?
So when you're talking about the insider, you're not talking about what Tom was just talking about, I think, where an employee's credentials are stolen and
right.
their identity is used to gain access to other pieces of the network, which
right.
happens in all of these, the vast majority of these network attacks, right?
right.
What you're talking about, an insider who is a disgruntled employee, somebody who has some malice against the company and uses their access to the network for their own personal gain. I think, again, it comes down to awareness. It actually, for me, there's a number of ways that you can do this. From a technological perspective, there's a lot of monitoring that can be done, looking for anomalous behavior, different activities that are occurring on the network. Somebody whose identity is being used to access the network at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday when they work Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. That's a red flag. Somebody who's moving data off of the network, somebody who's using USBs to an extraordinary rate. There are ways that you can use technology to monitor this, but I also think that there's a lot that can be done in the physical world. For example, when a frontline supervisor recognizes there's an employee who's getting a bad evaluation, or somebody who appears to be using drugs or alcohol, perhaps you can proactively start to monitor lawfully what that employee is doing on their network. The same way we do in the physical world. I worked in the FBI for a long time. When we have employees that have problems, we want to work to help the employees get better. That's the first priority. But you're also much more aware of the potential impact an employee can have to your organization, because the statistics say that these things often occur by somebody who's troubled, somebody who has just suffered a poor performance evaluation, et cetera. You've got to focus on the highest priorities. That's where the risks are. Focus on the risk.
You know, many companies have annual security training. You flip through the PowerPoints, you check, and boom, you get a certificate that says you've passed with flying colors. But obviously, a lot of issues with companies involve phishing attacks and emails that are opened by employees with no malicious intent whatsoever. I mean, how do you solve for that? Is it creating physical technologies that try to prevent, or is it security awareness programs? Do those work? I mean,
there's a lot that you can do, again, to detecting the anomalous behavior in the environment. You can train people, but there's going to be failure. I just talked to somebody today, and I'm trying to remember if it was somebody here or not, but a company that had half a dozen employees who received a spearfish. They actually had somebody physically call into the company and ask for credentials. And they had dual-factor authentication. They were asking for credentials, and 6 employees in the company gave up their credentials. This is a major company. This happened last week. So you're always going to have, human beings are fallible. You're going to have problems where they fail. If you have technology to back it up, to detect when something anomalous happens within the environment, you can respond to it quickly. You've got to continue to train, but it's not going to be 100% certainty.
For the spearfishing, I mean, there's not a solution, but there's a monumental policy shift that must occur that we need to all embrace DMARC. The reality is that emails are not authenticated, and people, unless they know how to read whether spoofed email, the headers have been spoofed, which is not that difficult. You'll never dispel the capacity of human intelligence gathering or social engineering to manipulate users to click on links.
Okay. I'm going to ask one final question before we turn it to your questions. So think about your own thoughts and questions for the panel as I ask mine. And that is, put you on the spot here. I think we've identified nation states as the most serious cyber attack threats. I mean, not to the exclusion of criminal organizations and terrorist groups and so forth and so on. But within that group of nation states, who should we worry about the most?
The Bahamas.
All right.
I'll call out Iran because of the asymmetric threat and because of sophisticated attacks that they have launched, including destructive attacks against Sands Casino that have been attributed to them by the USG publicly, where they destroyed, similar to the Sony attack, they destroyed infrastructure, and similar to allegations by many in the financial services sector that they may have been involved in a distributed denial of service attack against the entire sector for over a year, unmitigated. So those are two, I think, concerns by a nation state that has absolutely demonstrated their capability. We've actually been studying them for a number of years. We've done attribution to U.S. companies that have lost intellectual property, but the government has gone out and attributed specifically a number of attacks directly to the state of Iran. And that is an asymmetric threat in many ways.
Also Aramco.
Rami?
Also what happened in Saudi Arabia with Aramco that was attacked by the Iranians, as much as we know, stops 30,000 computers in one day. This is affecting the business dramatically.
Tom or Siobhan, you want to take a stab?
Most worried about in terms of having the resolve and the capacity to leverage it, sure, but I don't think they're the best hackers in the world. And China isn't the answer either in terms of best hackers in the world. I'm not going to name the country that is, because some of their people are probably sitting in the room.
All right.
Anybody here from the Bahamas?
I'm going to cancel those vacation plans. Siobhan, you want to weigh in?
I just said what he said.
Okay, all right, gotcha. All right. I believe I know what a declined comment is. All right, why don't we turn to audience questions? Do we have anybody who wants to be first and brave?
Yes, Randall Fort with Raytheon. So we've talked about defense and we've talked about response, but as just this last range of comments, there's all these offensive activities taking place. So as the prior panel discussed, should there be a role for dynamic defense or active defense by those who are being attacked to go back and respond more aggressively, more actively against those who are attacking them, be that nation state or cyber criminals or whatever the group may be. We keep hearing about attribution, but we've also heard a lot of the threat actors have been identified. There are a lot of companies that spend a lot of money and know exactly who is attacking them. So why shouldn't there be in the quiver of options an active or aggressive defense, dynamic defense for companies to use?
I think that today, with existing policies and capabilities, that probably is a bridge too far. I still believe that governments have the responsibility, and with the amount of effort that companies have done, private sector security companies as well as companies like yours, that have been successful in doing attribution, that if that intelligence is provided to the right organizations, that there should be, especially on the heels of the recent executive order, which talks specifically about financial sanctions that countries can be held to pay based on attribution and specific attacks. I don't know that from a technical perspective, honestly, that we want to get into that escalatory war today, and I think that much of this today, with existing capabilities and technologies, that it needs to be done in a way that is judicious, not necessarily from a law enforcement perspective, but from a nation-state to nation-state perspective. I think that this can quickly escalate beyond the realm of control, and when we have private companies that are involved in attacking nation-states, that is going to be fraught with peril. I recognize companies' concern. It was the comment I made earlier that if we were to share the intelligence and allow for a coordinated response, and one that companies actually feel is in support of their needs and is not retaliatory, but proportionate, then that probably is the first step today, given today's capabilities.
Tom, I've seen you quoted on this topic in various media reports. You have any thoughts?
His microphone.
I do think that the U.S. government needs to take a more forward-leaning stance on this issue and empower the Bureau and the intelligence community to act on behalf of those of us who are targeted and affected should we ask for help.
Rami?
I don't think this is a question only for the U.S. government. I think this is a question to the world. What we have to come out with war rules on cyber. We don't have it, and there started to be a work being done about it. In any case, I don't believe that a company should make the attack. If it is a nation which is attacking a company or another nation, this is something to be dealt by this nation. One thing that I read just lately is that President Obama decided that if you identify somebody or a nation which attacks any company in the U.S., the U.S. should take acts against their financial treasures in the U.S., which I think is great.
Shawn, how does this sit with you as someone who consults a lot of boards and so forth, the active defense posture that some have suggested?
Well, I think it goes, I agree with Shawn in principle. I think it goes back to understanding the notion of risk that the business is willing to take as well. It's not just a discussion around government-to-government actions, but you do have the whole geopolitical issue, right, where you don't want a company that getting involved in geopolitical issues that are very sensitive and not being able to, have additional geopolitical or policy decisions that are playing out impacted by that. But, I think in general, you have to figure out from a risk perspective as an organization, how far are you willing to go? What countermeasures are you willing to launch within the realm of, staying away from the active defense piece and address that separately?
I think that companies have to hold the government responsible, and I think that the reason we saw the executive order was enough consternation by companies, congressional representatives representing their constituencies, saying enough is enough. We need to do more. We don't. I think that that's important. Companies are fed up. They don't think enough's being done. The government, and Rami's position is absolutely right. This is not a U.S. issue. This is a global issue. And all governments need to come together in a responsible way to hold those governments that are conducting this activity accountable.
Siobhan, did you have a thought? Did you say you disagreed? Or?
No, I said I agree.
Oh, you agree? Okay, I was hoping for a little spice. Okay, great. Any other thoughts? Okay. Any other questions? Okay, all right. Sir.
So the panels this morning were trying to work towards or talk about possible international norms. And one of those norms, if I understood it correctly, was that countries should be held responsible for attacks that are mounted from within their borders. And on the other hand, this panel has made it abundantly clear how easy it is for systems to be compromised and subverted. So I'm curious whether you think that kind of norm is actually anything we can actually achieve in any reasonable amount of time.
Well, the treaty was espoused at the UN exactly to that effect, and the issue here is that there are a lot of bulletproof hosts and a tremendous amount of botnets that exist in the US right now because corporate networks have been compromised large scale. So then we'd be in violation of that treaty and immediately. But it's not because we are actors in this, it's because of the fact that we are more connected and we are more colonized.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and answer the question if that's okay. I'm sitting here with my international law dissertation mentor here, Tony Arend, so I better get it right. I think before we start talking about accountability for other nation states, we have to define the issue well and engage in a constructive debate, dialogue that just isn't happening these days. And there's a lot of bilateral discussion and so forth, and some multilateral organizations are taking this up, but we have a long way to go. I mean, it took the UN 40 years to try to define the word aggression, and they never really succeeded. And so I think it's going to take some time. I'm not going to say 40 years, but it'll take some time for there to be, I think, some true movement in this direction. And I agree that we need to get to international norms. ASEAN has even talked about a cyber code of conduct in Southeast Asia, but we're at the very early stages of this discussion, I think.
One more thing we have to do, we have to define what is a digital border. This is something that the world has to, maybe the UN has to decide, because maybe, I think it's not the same, geographical borders are not the same as digital borders. And then we'll be able to go to the next move.
Okay. And with that, I think that needs to be our last question. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much for a good discussion, and thanks to those who asked questions. Have a good afternoon.